Right. Hey everyone, I'm Klloo. So, rounding out our little discussion on basically the cost of entry for Flesh and Blood, we need to ask the big, serious question, right? What should it cost? Now, that's obviously a very, very speculative question. We're all going to have our own opinions, but I thought why don't we dive a little bit deeper into what LSS actually offers us to see if we can sort of gauge a relative answer to that question. Now, there are a ton of videos out there comparing Flesh and Blood to other games, right? So I don't want to do that. Again, I want to look at the tools and the products and the information that LSS is providing both old and new players with when it comes to going to X class, X hero, picking up X products, and actually getting into the main format of the game, which is, of course, Classic Constructed. Now, to summarize that, right, we have the nice and beautiful product line of Armory decks. Though Armory decks in themselves have one big major glaring fault, and that is they are too scarce, right? So LSS has this nice concept of wanting their cards to maintain usability across the longevity of Flesh and Blood, right? That is the crux of the Living Legend system. One hero rotates out, their cards don't, right? Not by majority, and then another hero comes and replaces them. So in that sense, the Armory decks would be this perfect mechanism to facilitate that, as well as to support releases. So, for instance, think High Seas, right? With High Seas, we don't know yet if we're getting a bundle. Nothing has been released about that, but we do know we're getting a Gravy Bones Armory deck. Now, the other point of view from that is to have access to a Mechanologist Armory deck and a Ranger Armory deck, right? We have Dash, we have Max upcoming, which is beautiful, and of course we have the Azalea Armory deck. So in that sense, LSS has set the groundwork through their Armory decks as this entry product to then help with getting people into this new set of High Seas. The problem with that is the Azalea Armory deck, again, is scarce. The Dash Armory deck, I'm sure, will eventually be scarce. And generally speaking, their print size just does not match this mentality. Worse yet, right, we have Savage Lands potentially coming at the end of the year. And now if that is the Brute focus set, and we are needing Brute cards, right, Guardian's taken care of, Wizard we just had, so Brute is basically the bottom of the barrel, aside from Illusionist, but Illusionist is in a sense a sort of specialty class, right? So I would highly expect Brute is relatively soon. So the KO Armory deck would be the perfect product to then get people into Savage Lands. You want a competitive foundation? Buy this Armory deck. Get your cards from Savage Lands, put them together, and get something relatively good. But, right, aside from the scarcity, you also have the actual power level of the Armory decks we're getting. They still don't come with a side kit, so although we are getting better foundational cards, especially when supporting new classes, new heroes, and archetypes, think the Max Armory deck and what it's going to do for Hyperdrivers, we still don't have a complete product when it comes to actually playing the format of Classic Constructed. Now, for reference, the first Strike decks did come with a toolkit, right? They came with arcane switches, which is beautiful, right? That makes them meta relevant if you were to take them to a blitz competition. But, however, the Armory decks stay at 60 cards. They don't even come with secondary equipment to do that job, meaning they are okay as this foundational product, but they aren't actually our gateway into Armory events. They are a gateway into Classic Constructed, but they aren't quite competitive enough. Now, the other rationale that we can then pull away from the Armory decks is how much does LSS actually value those cards. So for instance, with the Aurora Armory deck, it is $40, includes 13 Majestics, one of those Majestics being the hero. In comparison, we have our other variant of Armory decks by way of Origins, so our Jarl Vitretti Origins Armory deck being a $60 product, so $20 more, but including one Legendary, 23 Majestics, though those Majestics do include both the hero and weapon. Meaning, right, we're comparing 12 Majestics to 21 Majestics. In that sense, 4 playsets versus 7, plus the Legendary. So from that, we can sort of glean where LSS is placing the value of these cards. Now, from the manufacturing perspective, remember, the boxes are exactly the same, the card count is exactly the same, so from a manufacturing perspective, both of these products are the same to LSS. They're putting that $20 value as the Legendary and the extra Majestics. So the one Legendary plus the 10 extra Majestics essentially equates that $20 value. Now, I am personally very happy in just saying that the Legendary equates that $20 value, right? The Jarl Armory deck, even with its Majestics, I would still put comparative to the Aurora Armory deck. Aurora herself, although coming with less Majestics, still had very impactful cards that were only found in the Armory deck. So regardless of their rarity, that is the first printing of them, giving them a better monetary value. So if we say that one Legendary to LSS is equivalent to that $20 difference, then 3 Legendaries would be an extra $60, bringing us to a fully Legendary setup hero at $120, right? Now, in terms of the Majestics, again, we can do the same thing. We can say the rest of the box, right, is equivalent to our Majestics. So it'll be roughly an extra $80 to then get 40 Majestic level cards to replace the rest of the deck, right? Now, I'm not saying, strictly speaking, you're running a full deck of 60 Majestics. I'm trying to create a comparison in terms of the power level of card, right? So altogether, this means that to some extent, LSS values this whole package as around $200. Now, again, this is speculative and my interpretation of what LSS is presenting. But at the very least, we know $40, $60 on a legendary, right? And now potentially this $200 value to, again, get a proper competitive deck. Now, we can take this a step further because all of the Armory decks do come with recommendations, right? If you go to the Learn page for KO, for instance, it's recommended you pick up Blood Rush Bellow, your Scaling Flesh Bag, and Send Packing, right? These are the recommended cards to add to the deck. So we can take their base value, so KO $40, add in the recommended cards, and this makes it a $150 deck. Bolton, $40 to $71, Azalea, $40 to $484, and that one's rough, predominantly because they recommend Codex, and that's definitely a rough spot, right? Imagine you pick up your Azalea deck, you scan the QR code, go to the Learn page, you find the cards that LSS recommends, and all of a sudden you're out $300. Yeah, no. Dash, $40 with the recommendation, $166. Jarl, $60 into $168. And Aurora, $40 into $186. Now, again, this is using their base price, their MSRP. Obviously, the KO Armory deck has, unfortunately, again, due to scarcity, tripled, right? So $110 to $120 to pick up a KO Armory deck, right? Instead of that $40 range. But again, through the product released by LSS and then the recommendations that they are making to players, this is the price point that we come up with for a more competitive Armory deck, right? So again, around that $160 to $200 price range, which overall I do personally think would be quite reasonable. Obviously, that's not where we're at, but that would still be quite reasonable. Now, there are other resources that LSS does also give us, right? For instance, almost every set that is released, we get a dev download and some sort of deck list. So what I've done is I've taken the Zen budget deck list, right? It's the deck list promoted by LSS as their budget variant of a competitive Zen listing, and it is a full 80 card deck, so it's already, to me, a step above the Armory decks. I don't quite know why they wouldn't try to create something like this in terms of the Armory decks, but for the Zen deck, right, I've chosen Zen because he's top of the living legend. He's currently still involved in the meta, although he's definitely dropped off since he's been taken to the vet and neutered, but he's still a relative hero, right? So altogether, this budget deck comes out to $177. If we then go to the hero page, look at the card suggested for Zen, right, 12 Petals shows up, so we can add that in to make it a $184 deck, right? So $184 now to get an 80 card Armory ready list, right? Think that is a nice entry point. Sadly, that's not where we're actually at, right? If we go back to the prices of our cards, right, both legendaries and our class cards, now the pie chart on the left is basically the total cost currently to pick up a playset of every Majestic relevant to that class, right? So to pick up all the generic Majestics would cost you $2,062 currently, but what we can do is transform this data slightly. So we talked about in the previous video, properly dispersing value. So again, if more classes, more heroes were actually relevant, and people had a greater freedom of choice, that would help divert some of the pricing on these cards. Now, obviously, you'd still have outliers depending on playability, like Shelter from the Storm or Codex, where these are very, very dynamic cards that stand out on their own. But the numbers that we get to are definitely a lot more digestible. What we can also do is we can remove all the legendaries that were prior to FAB 2.0. So these legendaries are not only scarcer, but generally had more critical effects than what we see printed nowadays, right? Think New Horizon or Ferendale Spring Tunic. Both have ongoing persistent effects. Every 3 turns, you get a resource. And the New Horizon provides an extra arsenal slot as long as you meet its criteria. Both of those effects stand out when compared to newer Majestics. So think stand out when compared to newer legendaries. Think Balance of Justice, right? It has a strong effect, but it is something that you can only use once. Now, if we were to remove them all, the average price of a legendary drops down to $40. So, combining this information, we can then look at current top performing decks. So I've taken the 5 most recent first placing decks. We have a Jarl Battle Harden, 2 Aurora Callings, and 2 Aurora Battle Hardens. From there, we can take the average number of Majestics that these decks do run, and we are getting, with every set, to a greater volume of Majestics, making up the core set of cards for your deck, which is something I hope we don't always see, because again, going back to cards maintaining usability, regardless of power creep or upping card quality, it will get to the point where the pool just shifts everything to Majestic regardless of actual utility, right? But currently, the average is about 35 Majestics. So using the values that we have now, right? What we can say is 3 legendaries plus our 35 Majestics. So $120 for our legendaries if they're $40. And then for each class, that brings the total for Assassin to be a $456 competitive deck. Ranger, 408, the cheapest being Ninja at 191. But again, relatively speaking, a much better range than what we do see. So, for instance, all the first place decks that I used for this were actually around $1,400 to $1,600, right? So quite the difference, and I am using the lowest variant of every given card, right? So the cheapest possible deck, but in all honesty, that doesn't matter so much. Again, Rainbow Falls don't actually have a price point. Rainbow Falls don't actually have a price point relative to how rare they are. So there is a great need for reprints, but there is also this great need to help make more things viable and usable, to help disperse that value. If we got more in line with these numbers, I think a lot more people would be happy to get into the game, and they'd also have more freedom of choice to play different heroes and classes. Now, altogether, what this means is currently, again, Armory decks being this intro product, $40 to $60, right? We throw in the suggested cards by LSS, brings it to $160, and then in terms of the budget lists that they do promote, right, the Zen one was around $180. Personally, I would like the game to be around this $300 price. Again, going back to the price of, say, a case, having the option to either pick up a case of a current set or to buy a proper competitive deck for a hero would be fantastic. But what we do end up seeing, unfortunately, is current top performing decks, because of the way the meta works, the way usable cards actually work, means that we're sitting at around $1,000 to actually get a proper performing deck. So although LSS has this product line, this foundational set of products that they could use as the entry point to the game, as the correct entry point to the game, especially if they want to maintain Classic Constructed as the big format rather than, say, Blitz, then they do need to do a better job, right? The Armory decks and the suggested cards are fine, but we go back to the scarcity of the Armory decks and the fact that they could be a lot more impactful if they lasted 1 to 2 years. Having KO around for when Savage Lands does finally come would be fantastic. It means that from a manufacturing standpoint, they don't need to create these extra auxiliary products, right? They have the established product lines. But that is where I'm at altogether. So what's your opinion? How much should be the price of entry for Flesh and Blood, right? Remember, this is all really speculative, and it is a subjective number to every person. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.